I'd like to continue the introduction to the sources we're using in this course by talking about the 2nd century Greek author Apollodorus and the kinds of sources that he uses. Since he is, after all, talking about Greek mythology, a repertoire of stories that's been around at his time for well over a millennium. So first, let's get clear about the structure of his work. And what we read in the printed book falls into two parts. First, there are the words written by Apollodorus, which go under the title of the Bibliotheke, or library, implying that this is a scholarly collection of stories. However, from the middle of Book 3, and by the way, in classical studies, when we talk about books, usually we mean chapter. So, if you like, by the middle of Book 3, we lose the thread of Apollodorus' work. The manuscripts that survive from the ancient world for us to read do not contain anything beyond that point, but we know that there was more. And one of the ways we know that there was more was because we have a couple of separate manuscripts that contain a summary of the work of Apollodorus, not just what is missing, but all of it. And so in the printed book that we are using, from the middle of Book 3, you'll see that it switches over to calling it the epitome, which is Greek for summary. And what that means is that the narrative from that point on is sort of compiled together from those two manuscripts that do not contain the words written by Apollodorus, but nonetheless contain somebody else's summary of what he wrote. The introduction does contain this useful comparison of what the summary is like compared to what Apollodorus' work is like. You can see from the comparison that the summary contains about half as many words as Apollodorus' own work. So it still contains a lot of useful information, but there are much more details in Apollodorus' work. And we can do this because, as I said, the summary, it does summarize all of Apollodorus, so we can look at the parts of it that summarize parts that we do have to kind of see what it's worth. So I won't go into detail there. And again, you can pick that up from the introduction. I should say that much of what I say in this lecture, you can take as an epitome of what you will find in the introduction to the printed Apollodorus and Hyginus texts that we're using in this work, in this course. All right. So the summary does contain some interesting discussion of exactly what kind of work we are dealing with when we read Apollodorus. At one extreme, our editors say, we can form a picture of an industrious Apollodorus with access to an excellent library containing everything he might want. He read widely in literary and mythographic sources of all ages, including ones rarely read in his day, taking copious notes on the origins of various myths, tracking their variations among different authors, and compiling an original account. You can summarize that paragraph as, perhaps Apollodorus was a great scholar. But there's the other extreme is entirely possible, and I'll summarize this before reading it as, perhaps Apollodorus was just paraphrasing Wikipedia of his day. So at the other extreme, our editors say, we can imagine Apollodorus with a single work in front of him, a large and encyclopedic mythographic manual that contained many references, gleaned from earlier mythographic works and literary texts. Apollodorus' job in this scenario is to turn this huge work into something more digestible. So the editors there use the word mythographic manual. And although we don't have any complete works of mythography before Hyginus and Apollodorus, that is, we don't have anything like the work of Apollodorus from before the 2nd century CE, nonetheless we know that there were various authors who did produce such works. But we also know that Apollodorus and his ilk considered the poetic works of people like Hesiod and Homer, and more obscure poets like the female poet Telesilla of Argos, to contain authoritative and useful mythographic information. So there, under mythographers, there are a few of the names of much more ancient sources that are mentioned by Apollodorus, mentioned as in Acusilaus says the story works this way, Pherecydes says that it works this way, and so on. And one of the very useful things in our edition, the one that we're using, is that there's a nice, short and clear index that contains all those references to authors and works. So let's talk a little more in detail about who these early mythographers are. Again, quoting from the introduction to the Apollodorus and Hyginus book, the editors say, Hesiod's perspective is entirely internal. It is organization subordinated to artistic intent and storytelling. The prose mythographers, by contrast, wrote from the outside looking in. It's maybe not entirely clear what they mean by that. I believe we can paraphrase that as Hesiod wrote myth, whereas people like Apollodorus and the other people we're going to be talking about, the mythographers, they wrote about myth. So when Hesiod produced a poem, included a story in his poem, he wasn't judging it from any objective point of view. Rather, he was retelling the myth as a myth, with no interest, for instance, in comparing it to the way somebody else would tell the stories. Whereas the mythographers, people that we call mythographers, that's kind of a fundamental aspect of their work. They're always conscious that there are different versions of these stories, and they want their readers to be conscious of that. Generally, they want their readers to see them as the most perceptive judges of which is the best version. But nonetheless, there's always different versions. So one of the names used, I'll just go through a couple just for the sake of a little bit of detail, but also to give you an idea of how important the 5th century in Greece was for this change from that internal perspective to the external perspective, from writing myth, from composing myth, to writing about myth. And we can start with a man called Acusilaus, who was kind of at his height. He was flourishing, that's what that fl means, he floruit, roughly, that is circa in Latin, which is inappropriate because this is Greece, but never mind that. So he was at his height, he was flourishing roughly 500 BCE, the very beginning of the 5th century BCE. He's remembered as the first historian, but interestingly, he managed to gain that reputation despite the fact that he only wrote about myth. He didn't try to write about, for instance, early Greek history, the early Greek history of the previous 200 years, for instance. Rather, only things that were reported by mythological poets, poets who wrote myths, people like Hesiod and Homer, were topics that he cared about. So despite this reputation of being a historian, he is very much a mythographer. And he shares an interesting aspect with Apollodorus and several other mythographers. There's an obvious organizing principle to his narrative, and that is it's organized in terms of lines of descent. If you like, it's organized in terms of families. And as the introduction will tell you, what's characteristic about his approach is that he's interested in summarizing the stories and in some ways showing how they kind of fit together, but he's not interested in interpreting their value. He's not interested in, for instance, trying to look behind how a story might have come about. And in that, he can be contrasted with a near contemporary, a man called Hecataeus, who is also remembered as the first historian. He has a much better claim to that because he wrote not just about myth, but also about geography and as events which we would recognize as historical events, much more recent history, or if you like, recent history, as opposed to mythological memory. And he is known for, at least occasionally, and rather curmudgeonly, taking a skeptical perspective about a story as it is reported to him, which he signals at the very beginning of his work in a famous introductory fragment. And by the way, let me emphasize, we do not have the work of Acusilaus, we do not have the work of Hecataeus. What we have is little fragments like this reported to us by other authors. But anyway, supposedly his work began thus: Hecataeus the Milesian says this: I write what follows as it seems to me to be true, for the stories of the Greeks, and stories, the word he uses there is mythoi, the stories of the Greeks as I see them are many and laughable. And I've highlighted those two words because they are kind of significant in terms of the judgment that they convey. On the one hand, the stories are many. The implication there is that they are too many. Too many stories which, again, by implication, cannot possibly agree with each other. And they're laughable. They are not believable. They have not been subjected to any kind of rational principle of interpretation. I cannot resist showing you a modern reconstructed version of the map of the world that Hecataeus supposedly came up with. A nice round map with the ocean running around it. The ocean, you should understand, is conceived as a river that runs around the world. The ocean is that big blue blob in the middle. And as far as Hecataeus was concerned, the world was divided up into three separate parts. Libya, which we know as northern Africa, but which for him, broadly speaking, contained, amongst other things, the land of Egypt. Asia, which by Hecataeus' time was fully under the dominion of the Persians, and then Europe. Quoting the introduction again, because it's a good introduction, this interest in the truth behind myths and their origins pointed the way toward the second type of mythography, the interpretive, and may explain why Apollodorus never refers to Hecataeus as an authority. Right, that's key. Whether that interpretation is correct or not, it's pretty clear that Apollodorus is not that interested in interpretation. He is much more like Acusilaus. He's interested in summarizing and systematizing. I want to throw in a name here that's not mentioned in the introduction, but it's pretty important because Herodotus is in many ways the immediate successor and competitor to Hecataeus, and he is remembered not as the first historian exactly, but as the father of history. He's definitely the ancient Greek author who has the best claim to be the first historian. Above all, because his work contains a detailed narrative of historical events, events that were very close to his time. He wrote about the Persian Wars, the double attempt of the Persians to invade Greece in 490 and 480, and he probably was alive, albeit as a small child, at that time. He was at the very least a twinkle in his father's eye, as they say. But it should be said, too, that he wrote about much more than history. He wrote about people's customs, he wrote about geography, and about history. But when he begins his work, he begins with myth, albeit with a rationalized version of myth, which, interestingly, is narrated from the Persian point of view. So this is the Persian view of how events the Greeks tell in their myths came to cause enmity between East and West. First, the Phoenicians, the people who live in Syria, Palestine, they kidnap a Greek princess, Io, who is a figure from Greek myth. The Greeks, in revenge, kidnap a Phoenician princess who's called Europa, also a figure from Greek myth. The Greeks then, unprovoked, because now the scores are settled, kidnap the princess Medea from the eastern end of the Black Sea, that is Colchis. And the Trojans, now because they're mad about that, they come and they kidnap the Greek, the Spartan princess Helen. And the Persians say, I'll quote Herodotus, that they, namely the people of Asia, when their women were carried away by force, had made it a matter of no account. But the Greeks, on account of a woman of Sparta, gathered together a great army, and then came to Asia and destroyed the kingdom of Priam. And that from this time forward they had always considered the Greek race to be their enemy. So for the Persians, as reported by Herodotus, the Trojan War is a historical event, and it is the sort of the first move in, if you like, inter-civilizational conflict. Because for the Persians, all this kidnapping of princesses, whilst it may have been annoying, wasn't a cause for war. But for some reason, as they see it, the Greeks decided to take the last one way too seriously. And the conquest of Troy was the reason why Darius, the father of King Xerxes, was the first to attempt to conquer Greece. All right, here's some other names of sources covered. From the classical period, Pherecydes, Hellanicus, Theagenes, and Asclepiades. Pherecydes is Apollodorus' favorite source. So this kind of makes us suspect that he maybe was doing a bit of that careful scholarship in that he wasn't just reading from one big Wikipedia-type encyclopedia. But it also makes us wonder if most of the time he was sitting there with a copy of Pherecydes, and then every now and then he would throw in somebody else just to kind of spice it up a little bit. Then from the Hellenistic period, roughly the 3rd and the 2nd centuries BCE, we have a couple of slight changes to the way myths are collected and retold. We have, if you like, the first great rationalizers. On the one hand, Palaephatus, who the point of his collection of myths is to put together a compilation of the stupidest things that the Greeks have come up with in their myths. And then he argues that these are stupid, but they are actually just crazy exaggerations of what must have been originally mundane events. And then there is Euhemerus, whose name survives to us in the mythological interpretive method called Euhemerism, who in his sacred treatise writes a kind of parodic utopian story about traveling to a place where he discovers that the people that the Greeks think were gods were actually just very ancient humans. And so all of Greek myth is just a sort of distorted history of mostly forgotten real events.